Before we get to the episode, we want to take a moment to address the June 24th Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. This decision stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all Americans. This decision could also lead to the loss of other rights. To learn more about what you can do to help, go to podvoices.help. We encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word. Thank you. And now, a brand new Battle Fatigue. Welcome to another episode of Battle Fatigue. This one's going to be a little special today. Not going to tell you why yet. We'll hold that. Hold the cards a little bit.
I don't know why I'm singing the Jaws theme song.
It's okay. It's like Thriller.
Ooh, yes, because I am thrilled about the person that we are going to be talking to today. And you know what, kids? Dream big, okay? That is the theme of this episode. Dream big.
Dream big.
And also, be careful whose descendants you talk about, because one day you might come face to face with them. And so for this episode of Battle Fatigue, we find out what happens when you come face to face with a descendant of somebody that you talked about in the most awesome way.
And in case you forgot, I'm Dalen.
And I'm AJ. Sorry.
AJ.
You are going to understand why I am so excited and I forgot my name when you find out who our guest is.
It's another episode of Battle Fatigue. Let's go. So recently back in May, early May, we did an episode entitled Regulators Mount Up. We're still in a boat. And it was about the incredible spy thriller starring Robert Smalls. As far as I'm concerned, the movies, like we go to the movies to see James Bond, but James Bond goes to the movies to see Robert Smalls. All right, it's that simple. Okay, Smalls took over. Like we say he stole, but like that's really just putting it like plainly. I mean, we're talking about somebody who commandeered a Confederate steamship, and like it was a steamship. All right, it was the iPhone 13 Pro Max of steamships.
It was. That was nice. That was good.
And hey, thank you. And with planning, execution, his wife Hannah, and the captain's straw hat. I mean, he went undercover for freedom, and that's just the first chapter. You know what I mean? And of the life that Robert Smalls led, and you know, even Lincoln heard about it, and he was like, "Oh, you Negroes might just be what we need."
This might be a black man's.
Did y'all hear about this Robert Smalls
all?
character? Are they? Is that what's happening with them? Is that what we're doing? Because Lincoln's not who we've been told that he was. So you know, but that's a conversation for another day. All that to say, we did an episode of Robert Smalls, and today we have the distinct honor and pleasure of having author, keynote speaker, CEO, husband, father, legacy keeper,
multi-hyphenate,
great-great-grandson of Robert Smalls, Mr. Michael Moore. Thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, it's an honor. It's an honor. I really enjoyed your first podcast about Robert Smalls, and so it's really fun to be back here with you, and it's exciting to see where this will go.
At Battle Fatigue, one of the things that is important to us is to always be mindful of each other and our mental health, like kind of where we're coming from, and just kind of having that accountability, you know, to each other and also to the community. And we'd like to do kind of these check-ins with each other, and we wanted to extend that to you as well. I know that you're very busy. You were talking about earlier, you know, just, you know, kind of one meeting to the other. And so I just wanted to ask, like, how's it going? How you doing?
Thank you for asking. No, it's things are good. I am on the heels of a week in Maui, so the world is a beautiful place.
Let's go.
Nice. Black rest is important, okay?
Yes, thank you.
Especially on the heels of Juneteenth, black rest is important. And I can only imagine how hectic and joyful Juneteenth is usually for you, especially with the legacy of Robert Smalls.
You know, it's interesting because in my family, I'd say for the last 15, 20 years, I have actually personally recognized May 13th, which is the day Robert started on the 12th, ended up on the 13th. I recognize that as sort of our family's personal Independence Day. So for me, that is, far more meaningful than Independence Day. There was not a lot of independence among Black folks in 1776, obviously. And, you mentioned Lincoln. Let me just sort of throw a caveat out there. I'm not a historian. I actually have a doctorate in public history, but it was of the honorary kind. The university gave that to me because of the work that I did in helping to build the International African American Museum. But I've been in this space. I've been around history, and I've also grown up wondering a lot of things about history. Just to frame that, I remember really distinctly when I was in elementary school, maybe second grade, hearing that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I just didn't get it. Like, how does somebody discover something where there are millions of people who've been there for thousands and thousands of years? Like, I just didn't get that. So I've had this curious juxtaposition with history. Growing up being connected to Robert Smalls has been great, but then there have been other people at other generations who have also contributed a lot in my family to the country. So I've grown up with this interesting feeling about history, observing history. And so, you mentioned Abe Lincoln, and a lot of times the narrative around Juneteenth is that, well, Juneteenth was the day that the last day that enslaved folks learned that they were free, and it uses the Emancipation Proclamation as sort of the first anchor of that sort of historical experience. But the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody.
Heard that.
Abe Lincoln, sort of gave that about a piece of property, the Confederate States of America, that he had no power over at that time. So, from a practical standpoint, enslaved people, weren't impacted by the Emancipation Proclamation at all. So I just use that as an example about how history really can be molded and shaped and warped. And it's not quite, I grew up kind of thinking that if it's in the history book and if the teacher's saying it, it must be true. And I think the reality is a little bit more complicated.
Absolutely.
100%. 100%. And that's one of the awesome things about having, Battle Fatigue as a platform is part of what we try to do with like our history episodes is one, give agency back to Black people, right? Like Abraham Lincoln being called the great emancipator or the great uniter, like I understand where that comes from, but that doesn't give the full breadth of the story, because then how do you explain Una Judge escaping from George Washington? That was decades before Abraham Lincoln was even might have even been born, right? And so it's just like what we try to do here is give accurate and fair historical accounts of what happens with our own kind of battle fatigue flair, because history for me feels gatekept. It's like it's behind this wall of white male historians who get to dictate how Black people see themselves in these amazing moments. And one of the things I love about the story of Robert Smalls is there's no woe is me in his story, at least that I could find so far, right? He was born to an extremely strong mother. He ran around in the streets until the streetlights came on, and Rob was kind of just doing his own thing. There's a resilience in him that lasts from the moment I first heard about him as a young boy all the way through, up until his death, in the early 1900s. And so kind of like our first question for you is, when did you first learn about Robert Smalls as your descendant in like the historical of like, wait, great-great-grandpa did what? Or like, was it always just like, yeah, our family's awesome from day one? Like, was there like a moment that you really understood like who he was?
I had the benefit. It's a great question, and I really appreciate it. I had the benefit, really unique benefit, of growing up with Robert Smalls' granddaughter. Robert's granddaughter was my grandmother, and she was born in 1897 and lived with Robert up until his death in 1915. So she grew up, into young adulthood, kind of in and around Robert's home, and she would share all kinds of stories about him. In some corners, Robert is called, general, because he was a major general in the South Carolina militia. Others he's called congressman. I grew up hearing about Grandpa and hearing about the human being, hearing about certainly all of the achievements, accomplishments, his bravery, but also learning about the man, the father, the grandfather, and all that. So I grew up my earliest memories are of, and I was the kind of person who, how there are some kids who just love kind of sitting at the knee of the elders. Like that was me. I would be hanging, other kids would be out playing or whatever. I'd be hanging with my aunts and uncles and grandparents and learning and listening. And so I just kind of, it's always been there. I remember going to a family reunion. We had an aunt who had a motel in Cape May, New Jersey called the Planter Motel.
Nice.
And obviously she, sort of created that in honor of Robert. And we had a family reunion there when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. And I have distinct memories of engaging with my family there. So I always, grew up with it. And interestingly, to the part of the question about, kind of grew up always knowing that family was great or however you framed it. I just kind of, I just grew up kind of knowing that Robert was this person who escaped slavery and was a congressman and all this other kind of stuff. But there really wasn't much judgment kind of framed around that because, I grew up in the 1970s in Boston, which was a kind of caustic place for people of color. And certainly no one heard about Robert Smalls. No one talked about Robert Smalls. He was, just a kind of a casualty of history. One of the sayings that I like to use is that, there is this African adage, until the lion gets its own historian, the history of the hunt will always favor the hunter. Mm-hmm. Well, that speaks to the role that power plays in establishing history. Robert Smalls, again, I grew up in Boston. I heard about Paul Revere and all these other folks. And I'm like, I remember as a kid thinking, well, yeah, that was cool what he did, but Robert Smalls did so much more. Why don't we hear about him? And so I just kind of grew up and he was this figure that kind of on a family standpoint, we all looked up to, we all admired, but there was really no broader context or sort of interaction about him.
And, there's something that you said that was really interesting and curious for me. And I'm hoping, if you feel comfortable, you could talk to us about that. You said that you grew up with, Grandpa Robert Smalls rather than like Robert Smalls, the general, or Robert Smalls, the congressman. And I know for me, the narrative that I have of Robert Smalls is of those things. It's of the, brilliant tactician. It's of the, steamboat captain. It's of this. I don't know who Robert Smalls, like on an everyday level is, except for the like awesome things that people said about him within the community, right? He was very loved within the community. But I'm wondering, like, what was Robert Smalls? Like, was he a jokester? Because, I mean, look, if you're bold enough to be out after the street lights and you're bold enough to steal, to commandeer a boat, I wonder, like, what Robert Smalls' personality, like, was he playful? Was he a jokester? Was he strict?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have less of those details. With every generation, you lose a little bit more of that. My mother, for example, she grew up with Robert's daughter, Elizabeth, who was on the Planter. She was only 4 years old, but she was on the Planter on May 13th, 1862. And so my mother grew up hearing from her grandmother, who we called Mama Lizzie, and from her mother, all these direct sort of stories. Robert died in 1915. I was born in 1962. So the gap there is such that personally, I didn't have any interaction with him, but I did hear things. And again, I think the things that I heard were just that, that he was a man, that he loved his family, that he did have a sense of humor, and but also was one who was not afraid to stick his neck out and to fight for those things that he believed in. Just quickly, not to go too deeply into the story because you all have talked about it so nicely in the past, but Robert was the kind of person who allowed himself to dream big dreams. I think by virtue of the fact of having an opportunity to live with his mother longer than most enslaved children were able to, he got lots of good stuff from his mother. But I think also living around the big house and seeing the other kids, the white kids, and seeing their what their lives were like, and he just had a sense for what life outside of slavery might be in a way that perhaps someone who lived on a plantation just might not. And so I think he just, he the confidence of growing up with his mother, all of that good stuff that was instilled in him, I think gave him the ability to just dream big dreams. And then sort of in parallel with dreaming those big dreams, he just had the sheer audacity to think he could do something about those dreams. He could make them come true. And I think what the sort of the confluence of those factors in the early 1860s, with the fact that he was married, had two young children, and knew that his family could be sold from him, in an instant, just caused him to really, I mean, how I characterize it, he bet everything he had on everything he dreamed of. And he won.
The audacity of Black hope.
Yeah.
Ooh,
I mean, he was facilitating. This is somebody who got to kind of cultivate and facilitate his own idea of what freedom could look like from childhood. And that just wasn't something that a lot of Black children being raised in slavery were able to do, because it was all about survival, survival, survival. Yep. Here you have like just that seed. It's that seed that he's able to have, like being around his mother, that led to the life that he stole a plane. Like the idea, like you're talking crazy, Robert Smalls.
I mean, seriously. Most people are like, I'm going to escape slavery on foot. Maybe I'll build a boat. Robert's like, I'm going to just take that one. It's already fully stocked.
I'm going to just take the boat. Just take the boat.
That was, I think it was just driven by the love of a husband and a father, and just the sheer fear and anxiety of knowing that he didn't really have agency over his family, and wanted to do something about that.
You had talked about in your family, you see May 13th as a much more important date for you or for your family because of its impact, in Robert Smalls' actions. And I know that Charleston, of course, they have Robert Smalls Day, now. And that, coming from a state that was the first state to secede, was it like December 20th, 1860? They were like, yeah, we're out.
We're out.
We're quite fans of slavery. And so now there's Robert Smalls Day. Like, how do you, and you live in Charleston, like, how do you navigate that? Like, the state that was so adamant about slavery and how they saw Black people now have a Robert Smalls Day. Like,
so a couple things. First, we're not going to be able to appropriately do this topic justice because it's a long and complicated sort of topic that is informed by my sort of experience with building this African American History Museum in Charleston. What I will say in summary is, first of all, there's not a kind of standing Robert Smalls Day. May 13th, 2022 was proclaimed Robert Smalls Day, which was wonderful. And I think, there are plans to do further or additional kinds of celebrations in the future, but that remains to be seen. But it's complicated. You're absolutely right. Charleston, was really the capital of slavery. It was the place where the first votes of succession took place. It was the place where the first shots of war cannon took place out at Fort Sumter. It was the place where almost half of all the enslaved Africans who came to the United States across the entire transatlantic slave trade, where they took their first steps on a place called Gadsden's Wharf in Charleston. It was a place where, Charleston now is it's a small to mid-sized, small kind of a city, but for over 100 years, for a century, Charleston was the richest city in America because of the value of slavery that was created there, and in particular because of the rice industry that started there. So there is all of this history. And then sort of fast forward soon after the Civil War, Charleston began to see that the lost cause, creating this romantic vision of what the Confederacy was, gone with the wind, everybody loved each other, slavery wasn't so bad, all this kind of stuff, that became the fuel to their economy. They created, even right after the Civil War, this kind of historical tourism thing, which to this day is a major driver of sort of the city's economy.
Yeah.
But in the last number of years, things are sort of shifting and evolving. Former Mayor Joe Riley, who was sort of my partner in helping to sort of raise money and develop the International African American Museum, he sparked this idea of creating a history museum to elevate the stories of those people who landed there and all their contributions. The next mayor, current mayor, Mayor Tecklenburg, then actually issued an apology, an official apology on behalf of the city on its role in slavery, in the slave trade.
Wow.
And then this instance, the recognition of Robert Smalls, there is a statue to Denmark Vesey, who, if your listeners aren't aware of, you should Google.
We're going to do a story on him.
We will be doing that.
We're doing an episode on him for sure.
Excellent. Well, I have an ancestor connected to him too that I'll tell you about later.
We would love to have you back.
But in any event, so to get to your question, it's just this really complicated stew of history and narrative and economics and all this that kind of comes, sort of to play. And, you all may know that there was this big statue to John C. Calhoun in sort of the main square in Charleston that came down a couple of years ago. So there's all this stuff happening in Charleston, and we'll see where it goes.
I mean, that's kind of indicative of what America is dealing with right now in a way, right? There's a bunch of folks who are unlearning stuff. There's a bunch of folks who are relearning stuff. And in kind of the middle of all of that is all the emotions, the systemic injustice that we all have to like unpack and unravel. And so it gets messy and it gets heavy. And if we don't all kind of come to the table prepared to do the work and kind of lay our sword and shield down, then we get a lot of clashing, which is unfortunate because, I mean, just on a basic level, the story of Robert Smalls is amazing, right? Like if you remove kind of, the kind of messy, sticky parts of talking about it, the story is just simply awesome, right? To the point that they were like, those black people couldn't have, made this whole plan. Like there had to be a white person sprinkled in somewhere.
Well, it's interesting you say that. First of all, you've said a number of interesting things that maybe through the course of this I'll have an opportunity to touch on. But that point is a great one. First of all, it's hard to imagine with 21st century sensibility, or maybe it's not so hard. But yeah, the common conception of people of African descent back then was that they were akin to beasts of burden, that they didn't have higher kind of intellectual processing abilities and everything. So when Robert did what he did, to your point, there was this jaw-dropping kind of a response. In the South, of course, he was persona non grata. There was a bounty put on his head and everything else. But in the North, he was received as a hero, and there were parades and big parties for him. But it is really interesting to me because people have speculated about Robert's father, who his father is. And in part, I think that speculation is because they believe that there's got to be some white blood somewhere to allow him to have done what he did. It gets that deep.
I hadn't even connected the father piece to it. Yeah, because there's like discrepancies around who possibly could have been his father. But I hadn't even connected that he had to have some white in him to like be this bold. It was just like, I'm so
cunning,
used to
strategic. Yeah,
I'm just so used to people automatically assuming that black people are not intelligent that I didn't even think of the part where they're like, well, maybe he got some white. Maybe the white side in him.
23andMe? Can I see the 23andMe?
How many drops of white blood did he have in him?
Wow.
Dang, that's great.
Also
That's
wonder
crazy.
if like the North, because of course the South, said they had a bounty on them, and they were just like, it's just impossible. There's no way. But with the North, if the conversation was, do you really think that he? Who cares? We got a planner.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah, no, and I think that by virtue of the example of what he did in commandeering the planter, as well as I think the power of his sort of personal persuasion, I think that's what pushed Lincoln to allow formerly enslaved men, into the U.S. Army effort. It's an interesting thing because of all the things that Robert did, I've never heard anyone sort of point their finger to the fact that had Robert not been able to persuade President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton, then the whole U.S. colored troop phenomenon might not have happened. And there are many historians that believe that extra couple of 100,000 men was kind of what really allowed the United States to prevail in the Civil War. And so even getting back to the point that was made earlier about Lincoln being the great emancipator, no, Black folks were the people who emancipated themselves. They had to get an opportunity to do that, but they were the ones who sort of contributed to making themselves, to sort of emancipate themselves.
I heard that.
Just imagine if we didn't have like the colored troops, we wouldn't have had Denzel's single tear and glory. We wouldn't have had it.
Yo, don't come for the Massachusetts 54th like that, sir.
Wouldn't have had Morgan?
Or the 2nd South Carolina Regiment of African Descent, okay? Let's not forget about them and James Montgomery's crazy self running around with Harriet Tubman freeing people. It just is like, but that's the awesome thing about stories like the one of Robert Smalls is what I hope is after folks heard that semi-ridiculous retelling of the story of Robert Smalls, that you're curious enough to seek out other stories of Black liberation from the perspective of Black people, right? And, back to Robert's story, this is just a self-indulgent question myself. Is there a part of his story that is like your favorite? Like if you got to go do a TED Talk or if you have to go and kind of recount... which he's done. Yes, go check out Mr. Moore's TED Talk if you haven't already. Is there a certain part of the narrative of Robert Smalls that, like, when you start to get close to that part, you start to get like a little excited? I know for me, it's definitely when it's like, all right, regulators, like let's load the boilers. I'm gonna put the straw hat on, and we get to the first checkpoint. But I'm just wondering if there's like a part of it that when you are maybe when you're like also Grandpa Moore, that you're gonna let me tell y'all about your great great grandpa.
Yeah. I think for me, I take a step back from individual achievements and things that he did and look to just the way that he thought, the way that he allowed himself to think about himself. And, if you believe you're nothing, if society tells you you're nothing and you believe you're nothing, that's going to frame just the sort of the landscape of expectations that you'll have for yourself. Despite being a piece of property, despite being, effectively, less than zero, having no rights that a white person is obliged to recognize, Robert thought enough of himself to dream the dream of being free and then to do something about it and to actually, do it. One of my favorite quotes is, whether you think you can or not, you're right.
You're right.
Whether you think you can or not, you're right. And again, I think it speaks to this psychology of achievement. And so I think that for me, it's that. And then I think as well, there's a external public facing aspect of that. Robert dreamed these big dreams and then he achieved them, figured out a way to extend it to his family, and then came back and figured out how to extend them more broadly. So, he wanted to be free. He concocted this plan and took his freedom, seized his freedom through the planter, but then came back and fought for others to be free. One of the things that most bothered him about his being enslaved was that he was prevented from learning to read and write. And so the first thing that he did when he got his reward from the planter was that he hired tutors to teach him how to read and write. And then he extended that to his family. My great-grandmother was sent in the 1870s to a boarding school up in New England, which was probably the best school that would accept a young African-American girl at the time. And then Robert, when he had an opportunity in the South Carolina legislature, wrote the legislation to create the first free compulsory statewide public school system in America there in South Carolina, and extend that kind of opportunity to others. So those are the kinds of sort of attributes that really resonate with me. And to be honest, they continue to sort of push me to try to figure out in what ways am I going to contribute or build onto the legacy. And it's a source of inspiration and pressure all at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt that.
Because you're a black man who is successful. And I hope that you consider yourself successful. I mean, from what I've been able to kind of ascertain, he seems successful. And he wrote something on your website. You had kind of a series of writings that you did, and there's one that you did in 2020 that was just titled "Enough is Enough." And one of the things you said was, while slavery was a long time ago, since our nation never directly dealt with the social narratives that dehumanized Black people then, we have no choice but to live with their caustic residue now. I had to pause at that caustic residue. I was like,
That's a line.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's a line.
And then you said those narratives drive the conception that Black people are dangerous, violent, and animalistic. They are also the spark behind contemporary police violence. Now that police violence is something that is spread across pretty much like kind of naturally, like inherently spread across all of whiteness. And so when you have, kind of come up in your career and the things that you found yourself wanting to do, be it being a speaker, being a CEO, board member, author, like all of those things, and you're having to share those spaces as a successful Black man in these sort of, kind of inherently violent spaces, do you find that violence, like, do you see it like more so now, less, differently, like, or do you deal with it? Like, what is it like for you, like, kind of now?
It's a great question. I think, how did I deal with it? Just the best way that I could. That old joke or line, what do you call a Black man, Black woman with a PhD and all this other kind of stuff? What do you call them? A nigger. Mm-hmm. I think all of us in America who are different in some way, deal with their difference, their identity in ways that, sort of the best way they can. I think for me, in addition to having been in spaces that might be a little unusual for an African American to be in and having to navigate sort of just the racial sort of element of all that, I have 4 Black young men, 4 Black sons. And so, I also have to deal with, we talk about the conversation. Well, I have 4 sort of young men who I have to train and to just be concerned about their welfare in this world that is not often kind to people like us. So, it is what it is. I think for people in my family, Robert, we're talking about what he did. My great-grandmother, Elizabeth, her husband, was in politics, was a state legislator, was the publisher of a newspaper, was a lawyer going back, I think got his law degree from Lincoln University in the 1870s. The next generation, my grandfather was really deeply active in the civil rights movement in North Carolina. I have a cousin, Judge Harold Boulware, who litigated Briggs versus Elliott, which got rolled up into Brown versus Board of Education. And he was on the team with Thurgood Marshall that won Brown versus Board. Like every generation, I've had people who have pushed back against the system, who have fought for social justice, who have fought for African-American sort of political, social agency rights. And so for me, it's kind of like, okay, like I look in the mirror, it's like, bro, what are you doing?
Right.
And that's the kind of challenge that, But there is this phrase, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so I embrace that.
Awesome.
But it's complicated. It's really complicated.
It's a complex thing being Black. It's an amazing thing and a complex thing.
It is. It is.
And we just have to navigate that all the time.
Yeah, as a child of somebody who runs a nonprofit and was like employee number 20 for the Gates Foundation, and was a Truman Scholar, I used to get nervous when somebody would be like, "So what are you gonna do?" I'm like, "Dang, man, I'm trying. Like, I'm working on it." And also, like, I'm 21. Like, can I get like through my 20s before y'all start putting pressure on me?
Yeah.
One thing real quick before we kind of wrap up, as much as I thoroughly enjoy talking about Robert Smalls for obvious reasons, there was some pretty awesome Black women in his life as well. And so I was wondering if you could kind of speak to maybe how you would like the legacy of Lydia and Hannah to also be remembered and intertwined into the legacy of the Smalls kind of family lineage, because it's just like, Lydia was, from what I have been able to learn about her, Lydia was a badass in her own right. And then I know there's definitely some quotes from Hannah around the time of the escape on the planter. And I think one of the ones that really struck me was the one that we had used in the episode where she was like, we had made a pact that like, it's all of us or it's none of us. And also the fact that she remembered to bring this white sheet that could have turned the entire plan.
That was key.
This entire plan could have gone left if it wasn't for the strength and audacity of these two Black women also. And so I just was wondering, I just want to make sure we find time to honor those two Black women. And what would you like us to know or to hold as far as these two women in the legacy of Robert Smalls?
Yeah, again, another great question. You all are so wonderful in your thoughtfulness, and you all are very precisely going to aspects of the story that are not kind of the common, sort of thing. So I really appreciate that. No, I think, one of the things that I most want to try to accomplish in my life is to learn more about the women around Robert, to learn more about Lydia, to learn more about Hannah, to maybe try to learn something about even Lydia's parents, her mother. But yeah, they were strong. I got into the parenting business relatively late in my mid 30s, and my wife at the time was similarly. And so when we got pregnant, it was like a big thing, mid 30s, so it was considered like a high risk pregnancy, and we had to go through all these bells and whistles. And this was, in the 1990s. Well, Lydia gave birth in her, 40s, mid 40s, by herself on the floor, of her shack, whatever. I just can't imagine that kind of strength, that kind of resolve to just get it done, and to make it happen, and to invest in Robert in the ways that she did to make him what he was. There's no question that had Robert been taken away kind of around the time that typically youngsters are taken away from their mother when they're quarter hands, so to speak, I don't think Robert would have become the man that he did become. And so I think that's an extremely important aspect of the story. And, unfortunately, like, we don't even know where Lydia's buried. I am struggling to try to figure out, like, where is she? Like the mother of, at the time, a really famous United States congressman, they wouldn't have just, there's some information about that somewhere, but she just seems to have vanished.
You know what? We should reach out to Henry Louis Gates. Mr. Gates, we need a Finding Your Roots episode.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm about to get a bunch of Black women on this. I know a bunch of Black women Scorpios who most likely can get this message to Mr. Gates, because I think that would be an incredible episode if you were able to go and Finding Your Roots and then be able to discover like some of these histories. Because the unfortunate thing about the lives of enslaved Black people is they weren't recorded. They weren't deemed important enough for recording, which is insane because the way that Black folks were able to live their lives tell a lot about what the country was going through, kind of gives a roadmap as to the growth or demise of certain aspects of the country. And that's why I really appreciate, narratives like the ones that we have in William Still's Underground Railroad records, because we have some of the most important firsthand accounts of what it was like escaping enslavement. And then when you look at that in comparison to the Robert Smalls story, you really understand the magnitude of what he did. And not only just for him and like his immediate family, but like, what does it mean for those other people who were able to get out and their descendants, right? It wasn't just that Robert Smalls was able to get his wife and kids out of enslavement. It was that these other people were also able to get their wife and kids out of enslavement. And so what does that mean for the legacy of Robert Smalls when you then also think about the fact that this guy came back, built a school, like created a community, became a congressman, and then enacted policies and then stuff that adversely affected the life of white people in their minds, because of course they always assume that the pie is finite and not that the pie grows with us. But that in and of itself is one of the most brilliant stories of Black resilience that doesn't have this like white savior complex to it. And so Sultan is going to ask the last question because I am just like internally trying to freak out. And also my mom keeps sending me text messages of like, can I slide in and come and watch because she's so pumped. But we do like to kind of close out this session by asking you something a little personal and seeing how you respond to it.
Well, before we do that though, I know that you mentioned that there was some, you mentioned the episode and kind of hoping to be able to touch on maybe a couple of things that was said then, and just wanted to kind of give you opportunity. Oh, yeah. Was there anything there that?
No. I mean, I'm happy to elaborate on anything or whatever, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I love, I don't know how to say this, a more contemporary expression of the story that I found there, and appreciated the love for your man, Rob.
My man Rob.
My main man Rob.
I love it.
Yo. At no point ever in my life did I think like somebody in Robert Smalls' family is ever going to listen to this, because like, why? Why would that happen? So I was just talking like, look, this is my main man Rob,
I love it.
And I think, like as far as like my generation, Daylin's generation, the folks that are under me, history is taught in such a way with a language that forces us to have separation from it. And I don't like that. I come from a tribe of storytellers. My family's from Kenya. A lot of the lessons that I was taught as a kid were like proverbs. Like my grandpa used to explain my small ears using the story of the rabbit. And it was like, why does the hare have long ears? Because it listens to its parents. And it'd be like, maybe you'll grow into your ears if you like did a better job listening. So storytelling has been an integral part of my upbringing. And also naturally, Black people are amazing storytellers. So it's like, why not be able to give historical information in a means that like just fits with us, the colloquialisms, all of that, while also still honoring and respecting the amazing person that is Robert Smalls. But yeah, I'm glad that it was not considered disrespectful, because I have a lot of respect for your family.
Okay, so like I said, I know in the beginning I said, no, you're busy, so we'll wrap with this. And I want to thank you again for being here and continuing to honor that legacy and to being the successful Black man you are, and just existing in the power that is that, and raising these 4 boys, and, just being the example that they need, the way that, Robert Smalls' mother, with Lydia, what she did. Like, you carry that. And I want to say that, we've only had a couple of conversations, but I feel like that this legacy, your family, they're good. You're there, you're good.
Thank you.
That you're doing good things, you're doing good work, and I don't think there's anything to worry about.
Thank you. I mean, it is a challenge, because the intimacy with the story, the connection with the story gets harder and harder. It gets sort of weaker and weaker with every generation. I mentioned, my mother and my grandmother lived with people who were on the planter and who were sort of there. My sons, who started being born in the 1990s into the 2000s, it's just a more challenging. I remember when my middle son was maybe 6, something like that. We were talking about African American history around with my dad, and who at the time was maybe in his early 70s. My son looked at my dad with this real earnest, innocent look and said, "Grandpop, were you a slave?"
Oh no.
And of course we all broke up laughing, because my dad was born in the 1940s. But that it just speaks to the fact that history, like the context for this, like it's all ancient history to people who are, in their teens and early 20s
Right.
now. And so, trying to frame it in a way that is relevant and that has some context is more and more challenging.
For sure.
What has Black joy looked like for you?
Well, for me, it is always in the shape and form of my family. My kids, my wife, my mother, my sister, and her family. I was put on this planet to be a dad and to raise these young men and to elevate them, to pass on these stories and to push them forward. And so that is for me just the highest expression of my sort of capabilities and my vision for my life. And I love Black people, and I appreciate our challenges and our struggles. It is common for Black folks to sometimes be critical of other Black folks. For example, I've written and talked about reparations for a lot of years, and there are some Black folks who say, "Oh, what are you going to do with reparations? Go out and buy Cadillacs and fried chicken?" And I'm like, people can buy whatever they want to buy with it. That's the point. But I believe, I think if you'll allow me for just 2 minutes to tell a story.
Please.
When I think about Black folks, I had a chance to go to Sierra Leone a couple of years ago, and my DNA came back that it was from that part. And so I was there with a group, and I just happened to be with the mayor of Sierra Leone and spent time with the president and the others. But to make a long story short, they sort of produced this homecoming for me. We drove about 4 hours into the sort of middle of the country. And as I got out of the car, this woman who was looked like she was in late 80s, early 90s, came up to me and grabbed me by the shoulders and looked at me and said, "Are you my son?" And I said, and I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know the whole village town was there. And I said, "Yes." And to make a long story short, the paramount chief, the most senior person there, and that was his wife. And they took me through this amazing ceremony where they prayed for me, they blessed me, they clothed me, they named me, they fed me. And the whole town came to see me and to touch me. And as I learned at that time, this was from an area in Sierra Leone where lots of people had been taken in slavery. And of all those people hundreds of years ago who had been taken, I was the first to come back with that same blood. And and this was in, I don't know, 2019 or something, 2018. And so I say all that to say, when I think about our challenges and struggles and when I just think about Black people in general, and what gives me a source of sort of Black joy is just to think about history, maybe in a little bit of a different way. I think about those people who were kidnapped in the inland of Africa and then marched to the coast. And that in and of itself was a treacherous endeavor, and many were lost getting to the coast. I think about those people who survived, who then were put on slave ships and were sent to the Americas. And obviously we know that many lost their lives there and were thrown overboard, so much so that the sort of migratory patterns of sharks were in the Atlantic was changed to follow the ships, heading west. But of those who survived that, slavery in and of itself was just a mortally dangerous and deadly kind of an endeavor. In some parts of the world, and down in South America, it was basically a conveyor belt. They would literally work people to death and then just simply get more. And there was a little bit of a different sort of dynamic in the United States, but even so, just so many people died. And so when I think today about Black folks, what all that means to me is that those of us who are still here, that means that we are descendants of the strongest of the strong, people who survived at every turn. And so for me, I think what that means is that what's inside us, there's a superpower, a super strength that is inside every living African American to this day. And so part of what I see as my opportunity is to help tell that story and just to share just a bit that strength is there. It's within us all. And life has a way of throwing all kinds of obstacles at us. This country has never really embraced people of African descent, but we're still here and we're still achieving. We're still thriving. Black joy for me, because I've got this historical bent, I think is about acknowledging our past, acknowledging the enormous achievements that we've made globally, but certainly here in building this country. And I think acknowledging that despite the many, many trials and obstacles that are in front of us, that our future is bright because we're going to make it bright.
Mm. I love that. It's cool. It's okay, Dalen. It's cool.
Wow.
Just,
I mean, I would expect nothing less. Michael Moore, thank you for joining us today on this episode of Battle Fatigue. Very special episode to talk about yourself, your family, legacy, Robert Smalls, Blackness, and just doing that with your authentic self. Hopefully this won't be the last time we speak, but yeah, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It was an honor. It was an honor.
Absolutely.
We appreciate it. So, Michael Moore just left.
That was
wild. That was
insane. That was insane. They tell you not to meet your heroes. And not saying that like Michael Moore exactly is my hero. I do have Stan, his great-great-grandfather, though. Right? Like I'm a full Stan. I'm a full Robert Smalls
It's kind of
Stan.
like vicarious a little bit.
Yeah, and then by default, I really enjoy Mr. Moore because I've gotten a lot of good information about Robert Smalls from Mr. Moore. But Mr. Moore is just really nice. Like he's engaging. He's not like he's just like, yeah, that's my. And he also is like happy that we are retelling the story of his descendant in a way that is more accessible.
He was there.
Like
my man Rob. He was there.
Because never in my life did I ever think that the descendant would be like, yeah, nah, I heard you talking about. Because I'm waiting for one of Frederick Douglass's descendants to come with the.
That just goes to show that, what you're doing good things. It's like the way because he talked about being a storyteller, and because we are storytellers.
We are storytellers.
And the way that you are telling these stories, tell your own story, Black stories, is like, you're doing great.
We are onto something, Sultan. We are onto something.
I think you might be right.
I think these Negroes might be reading. Reading ass Negroes. But yeah, that was epic.
Thank you for listening to Battle Fatigue. Our show is produced by the folks over at Larj Media. That's LARJ Media. Special thanks to the team at Good Juju for brand design and Roger Habone for theme song production. You can find other episodes of Battle Fatigue wherever you get your podcasts. Also, for updates and more, be sure to follow us on social media at Battle Fatigue PC. Thanks again for listening.